What's up, everybody? Well, last week we talked about how the game industry is actually facing structural transition, especially this year, with a lot of things changing in the marketplace that actually makes growth in our industry very difficult. And so, what I wanted to talk about today is what are different models for growth by game companies given a lot of these structural changes. And so, what I'm going to be talking about are four kind of growth paradigms that are being adopted by four public or soon to be public companies: Zynga, Applovin, Skillz, and Jam Cities. And each of these companies represents a different growth strategy, which I want to discuss, but kind of like a quick summary in terms of what these companies are doing. First, Zynga. So Zynga is shifting from a content M&A based strategy, which has been their strategy over the past 5 years and has been largely responsible for essentially all of their growth. Going from that to an ad network, ad tech, vertical integration strategy. One, they've got two growth vectors, that as well as shifting increasingly cross-platform. The second company we're going to look at is Applovin, which is really trying to become, so they started as an ad network. They then acquired a lot of content companies, a lot of game studios, but now they're actually trying to become the Netflix of gaming. And I'll explain later what that actually means, because it's not like the cloud-based Netflix of gaming definition that you may be thinking of. The third company we'll look at is Skillz, which is actually trying to build a scaled competitive wagering platform. So more of a platform type of play against competitive betting. And then fourth, Jam City appears to be focusing on like an upstream and earlier stage content M&A strategy, as well as focusing on launching IP-based games. And so the first company I want to talk about in more depth is Zynga. Essentially, what we're talking about is the end of the M&A gravy train. And as discussed, if you missed it in terms of last week's discussion, but essentially the easy pickings phase for game company growth through content M&A is essentially over. And Zynga has arguably been the most successful of mobile game companies at leveraging M&A for growth over the past 5 years. And so while Zynga has continued to show growth over the past year and likely has growth locked in, I would say, just based upon their existing slate of acquisitions over the next, let's say, year or two, the bigger question comes when we look further out into the future, more into the mid to long-term outlook for Zynga. Then how will Zynga grow if not for content M&A, which has again been responsible for essentially all of its growth? So I think that what we can do is just look at recent moves, which do seem to indicate a strategic shift away from this model. And so we'll talk about what I believe their next strategy is. And so one of the things that we've seen from an executive team perspective is the departure of M&A superstar Chris Petrovic, who essentially led all of the M&A for Zynga over the past 5 years. It's been a massively successful run for those guys. But when you see the key guy responsible for that leave, I mean, clearly that potentially indicates a shift in strategy. We've also seen indications by public announcements, disclosure, as well as from the recent announcement of the acquisition of ad network company Chartboost, which was announced last month for $250 million. So we're seeing that, as they had indicated, and from this recent acquisition announcement, that they do fully intend on shifting to kind of an ad tech owning ad network type of model. And finally, the other indication that we've seen in terms of the other growth factor that they're likely headed towards is probably a shift to cross-platform. And we've seen that through market moves in terms of the acquisition of Ector Games, which is the kind of ARPG, the Torchlight 3 studio based in San Francisco, essentially to expand cross-platform capabilities. But they've also announced cross-platform on the latest game that was announced, Star Wars Hunters, which was announced as a cross-platform game, both supporting mobile as well as Switch. So kind of like a small step, but we can see that that's kind of where they're headed. And so In my own personal view, I think what happened is, and this is speculative on my part, but I believe that the Zynga executive team basically saw the writing on the wall for continued growth, at least through content M&A, and essentially just decided to follow Applovin into ad tech. They saw what they were doing. They saw the growth that Applovin had based upon that strategy and decided to follow them further. They also realized the potential for the cross-platform market, given the success of games like, and in particular, Genshin Impact. In addition to that, more recently, we've seen from the disclosures from the Epic versus Apple trial that when we saw, for example, the platform share of Fortnite across various platforms, it was kind of widely discussed by a lot of people in the industry, but there was a specific chart, and I'll put a link in the show notes, that showed Fortnite's revenue share on various platforms from March 2018 to July 2020 that essentially showed 7.5% of revenue coming from mobile and essentially 92.5% from PC and console. Now, by the way, I think what you should take away from that chart is that console poses a very strong opportunity, a market opportunity for free-to-play games. However, you should also note that with respect to the chart that was disclosed that was publicly disclosed, that console contribution is a bit overstated. And the reason for that is, for example, when you think about the actual situation during when Fortnite was first being launched, we saw that on Android, the Android launch was delayed, and then only on Samsung. Further, Epic opted to go with their own launcher on Android. And so when they did that, and all of the friction that was caused by having their own launcher in terms of all these warning pop-ups that popped up, and due to Google's restrictions, that created a very high friction FATUI, an install process for their launcher. Further, when we look at mobile, we also saw that on iOS during launch that Fortnite had super high device requirements. In fact, I think on iOS, of the top 100 grossing games, that in terms of device requirements, Fortnite was number 100 out of 100 in terms of device support, right? So it was actually the worst, despite being one of the top performers from a revenue perspective. But then when you also look on the Android side, and Android relatively underpowered relative to iOS, we saw an even bleaker picture in terms of device support on the Android side. So anyway, just to underscore the point that I'm trying to make there, though, is that kind of indicates that the potential market opportunity on consoles actually quite good for free-to-play games, that we are increasingly seeing the opportunity with cross-platform development frameworks like Unity and like Unreal, that the costs to actually port are getting lower and lower. And that when you look at the Zynga management team, there are a lot of ex-EA executives. So it's not like they don't understand the console or PC market as well, right? So that, from that perspective, that makes sense. So in terms of an overall Zynga outlook, I just want to make clear that I'm not a hater. While I personally wasn't a huge fan of Zynga pre-Frank Jabot, I mean, I've publicly commented on public podcasts very positively in terms of Zynga's execution, at least from an M&A and growth perspective. But clearly, when we look at what's happening today in terms of the structural shifts that are happening in the industry, and the shift from Zynga's management team to a different strategy, anytime a management team adopts a completely different strategy, there's going to be some execution and market risk. And so given that, while I am positive on Zynga's growth over, let's say, the next year or two, I think medium to long term, Zynga, in my opinion, is definitely challenged. And so just think, if you look at Zynga's numbers, is revenue numbers, if you think what would have happened to Zynga if they aren't able to, for example, find the next peak or small giant, then a lot of that growth basically goes away, right? So, anyway, just kind of summarizing here, a few thoughts on their basically two growth vectors, right? So, ad tech, vertical integration, and cross platform. And on the first part, the ad tech vertical integration side, so my belief is that Zynga is essentially opportunistically following this path, largely based on essentially a copycat model of Applovin, but I think that they're kind of one step behind. I mean, when you look at comments from Zynga's management team, it does seem a bit confused and not super consistent in terms of approach or how this is going to work. I mean, are they going to be a walled garden, or do they do more of an open ad network? I'm not sure if Zynga realizes fully this issue around data integrity and having a sort of compromised model with respect to having competitors share their data with the ad network that they're using, and Zynga by having their own first party content studios, that does pose a competitive situation, a competitive risk. And so anyway, I think there's some risk there of that strategy not playing out the way that Zynga thinks it'll play out. I also think that Zynga does not have a very specific view with respect to IDFA deprecation, which is totally fair given we're still learning more about the impact of IDFA deprecation and still kind of playing out. But it does seem like Zynga is kind of winging it here. And at least I haven't to date heard any clear articulation of what their perspective or how they plan to address IDFA deprecation is. Now, they have said some things in terms of IDFA or of IDFV and addressing IDFA deprecation through IDFV, but even that is highly controversial and, to me, not a real clear response to IDFA deprecation. I think there are other deeper implications from a product perspective, monetization perspective, things like that. And that's something that nobody from the Zynga management team has specifically called out. And so while I think it's important to note that while Zynga is kind of following Applovin down this growth path of ad tech, ad network, vertical integration, it does appear, though, that when you think from a strategic perspective, they're not the same. So Applovin, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, they're going more for a walled garden Netflix of gaming approach, at least by public comments anyway. And whereas it seems like Zynga is taking this approach of trying to have the best of all worlds by, not only capturing additional margin from owning the ad network, but also having an open ad network in which competitors will gladly, participate in their ad network and give them their data and trust them not to abuse their data and that trust. And I think that's naive, right? I mean, it's naive either on the side of Zynga or on the side of the customers. So one or the other, right? You can't have both things being true. And so for me, this growth vector fundamentally holds the most risk. I think game studios are becoming increasingly wary of sharing data with compromised ad networks. And unless there is significant competitive advantage that comes from that ad network, so either Zynga is able to get enough scale so that if you want to get enough volume in terms of ads, you have to engage with Zynga's network, or if Zynga is able to come up with a capability, right, like auto ROAS from potentially acquiring an MMP and doing some stuff that some of the things that I talked about last week, then I think that this path could face some significant challenges. Now, on the other side, in terms of cross-platform, a lot more promise there. I think there's a lot more capability and expertise, as I mentioned, from the management team on that side of the business, and we'll see what happens there. But certainly on the first growth vector, I think that while I'm not going to count them out, there's just too many things changing. There's a lot of things that are happening right now. There's certainly an opportunity for them to do that. I would place a heavy discount against that growth vector and probably be watching more of the growth vector around cross-platform instead. So let's talk about the next company, Applovin, which by the counts of CEO Adam Ferrugi, he is calling the Netflix of gaming. And so according to Adam Ferrugi, the Applovin CEO, and let me actually read a quote from him for you. He stated, quote, that first party data feeds our software and then creates ability for us to do much better at recommending feature content to customers. I guess maybe the best analogy to really compare that to is how Netflix took their own data on their platform and rolled out personalized recommendations. Then they layered on their own original content, which exploded the amount of consumption on their platform and gave them more insights into their audience, replicating that same playbook in a new media format. So that was a quote from Adam Frugi. And so, taken on the face of it, a true Netflix of gaming approach means that Applovin is viewing ads as their Netflix style recommendation platform. So this is a concept that I think has a lot of implications. And so first, let me explain that a little bit more, right? So when you think about Netflix, when you watch Netflix, Netflix owns the app, right? You log into the Netflix website, or if you're watching it on your PlayStation, there's an app where you see Netflix, and then the Netflix app takes the data of what you've watched, what you liked, takes a lot of that behavioral data, and then recommends other content to you. Now, what Adam Ferrugi is saying is that they are the Netflix of gaming, not from a content consumption perspective, but more from the perspective of personalized recommendations. That Applovin is going to study the behavior of their players on gaming, their own gaming portfolio, and then the ads act as that recommendation platform. That's their app, right? So the ads will then say, okay, we think that we know who you are, and we think that you're going to like this other game. And so that recommendation platform is essentially the ads. The other thing to note, though, is that if that's right, and and I think what we've seen, and I think that based upon a lot of the comments from Applovin, that's probably the path that they are going after. I mean, what we've seen is that we're starting to see this build out of this recommendation platform, right? And so they've, like Applovin has essentially applied a shit ton of data analysis, machine learning to optimize recommendations and prediction on ad serving. And I also wanted to read you a quote from the Applovin S1, where it stated, quote, our core technologies are robust, having processed over 3 petabytes of data per day on average, as many as 3 trillion predictions per day, and up to 6.5 trillion events per day in January 2021, while remaining flexible enough to rapidly adjust to our customers' evolving needs. Our app graph stores and manages anonymized data from hundreds of millions of mobile devices we reach every day, while our Axon engine then leverages to better predict and match each user to relevant advertising context. So the question that I think we need to ask is, if the crux of the business model is around this Netflix of gaming model, the recommendations engine predictions part, does it make sense if, let's say, you're Netflix, to recommend content on competitive services like Amazon or HBO or Disney Plus? And I think the answer is no. And so while I believe that Applovin would like to continue to have an open ad network and serve external customers, I think they are fully prepared for the situation in which they become a fully walled garden, right? And so I also think that when you look at the financial disclosures from Applovin, that they've kind of prepared some of their financial disclosure in a way to prepare the public for a time in which that segment of revenue kind of goes away in terms of ads. Because one of the other things that happens is, what happens to your ad revenue when you don't have external customers paying you for ad to promote their games? basically that ad revenue goes to zero. That ad revenue goes to zero, but then you get additional margin on the content side of your business. If you think of the content layer expands in terms of revenue, the ad revenue decreases, right? So, I mean, I won't go into too much of the financial disclosures. You can kind of look that up for yourself. I'll leave a link in the show notes if you want to dig into that a little bit more. But the way in which we saw Applovin break out revenue by games, not as a vertical, but against like game revenue, which they're calling consumer revenue, which is only IAP based revenue, and then they broke out everything else as business revenue. I think what they want us to do is they're preparing us for a time of what happens if they shift to this model and that business revenue or the ad revenue does go to zero. Then what they want you to see, however, is the consumer revenue continuing to grow. Because essentially what they're going to want you to continue to see, or the public investing audience, what they want them to see is continued growth against the core segment of their business, the consumer revenue part. So I think that, this is something that I have spoken to a lot of people in the games industry about. It's hard for them to wrap their head around for whatever reason. And a lot of people continue to call Applovin, oh, they're just a gaming company, right? You've got the content, IAP gaming revenue, you've got the IAP, or you've got the advertising revenue that's generated from the games, but that's not how they're breaking it out. So when you think about the sources of revenue and what could potentially happen based upon the shift in strategy, I think it's important to understand that nuance because, to be honest with you, a lot of people in the gaming industry just don't get it. And so that's what I think we can be seeing in terms of Applovin, that again, business revenue or the external advertising part of the business revenue could significantly decline, potentially go to zero, but then revenue should flow from the business to consumer revenue, at least on a accounting perspective. And so again, while I fully expect Applovin to try to hold on to external customers that continue to feed that external ad revenue side of their business, I do think they are fully preparing for that part to go away. And the reason why I think that they're continuing to try to hold on to that external part is because we do continue to hear about Applovin potentially working on things like auto ROAS, for example. And that would be something that would provide that value to external customers that would then, be a risk decision, right? And so if you are an external customer thinking about, should I give Applovin my data or not? Could they compete against me? But then if you have these external capabilities, if you have the additional scale or performance that you would get from participating in Applovin's ad network, then it's a business decision of whether you participate in that or not. But another reason why I actually think that they potentially don't care about that business revenue or the ads part of the business revenue, external ads part of the business revenue, is that what we've seen is this continuation of actually competing against their own customers. And so what we saw was the launch in like last month, or maybe it was a month before, of a game called Life Simulator. And this is a game that's they Applovin launched a game called Life Simulator Best Life, which happens to be very similar to Candy Writer. Candy Writer is a studio under Stillfront, a game that they have called Life Simulator. And what we've seen is that Candy Writer is an Applovin Max customer as well as an Applovin Ad Network customer. Did something happen? Was data used? Again, this is that murky issue, right? We don't know. We'll likely never know for sure, but the potential there absolutely exists, right? And so my outlook in terms of Applovin overall is that I have massive respect for the Applovin management team. You could potentially consider them, and likely they have the smartest, most aggressive, and execution capable executive team in the free to play industry. And despite what you might consider a huge vision and probably extremely difficult vision to execute in terms of this Netflix of gaming model, I don't think it's wise to count them out. And while, I mean, valuation is a separate issue, I won't talk about valuation here, but from a content perspective, I think, Applovin's biggest challenge is going to be transitioning from having essentially a core competency in ad tech to content development and managing studios. So that's what I would look for, right? I would look for their ability to do that. Uh, Netflix made a similar transition from logistics and infrastructure to streaming and content development. So I think it's possible, but then you'd want to see a number of moves that Applovin makes at the executive level that shows you that they're going to be able to make that transition to better manage uh, a wider set of content studios that's not just closer to top of funnel, meaning more casual games, games that have longer ARPUs, payback periods, games where you're going to have to understand deeper monetization, uh, you know, much more complicated player behavior that you see in kind of mid-core to hardcore games. And so while I think they have as big or even more of a challenge than Zynga, I've learned it's not wise to count against ruthlessly executing management teams. And I do think Applovin has that. And so what are some of the things you should keep an eye out for? You should keep an eye out for the evolution of kind of what they do from a walled garden versus open approach to their ad tech business. And in particular, you should watch this shift in terms of how they're reporting consumer versus business revenue. You should try to keep tabs on Applovin's ability to execute against additional capabilities in terms of their ad network, such as an auto ROAS capability. I think you should also then keep an eye out on their ability, as I just mentioned before, their ability to develop content development capability in the form of whether it's additional executive team hires or the ability to acquire additional studios in genre expansion capability. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on Applovin, Zynga and Applovin. And the third company I want to talk about is Skillz. And so unlike the other free-to-play game companies, Skillz is, I would say, playing especially fast, loose, and risky for growth. They have the most risky business model in terms of difficulty, but also having the highest upside. I mean, they're differentiated in the sense that instead of kind of a pure content play, they are essentially enabling a competitive matching and wagering service that would sit on top of content developed by other game developers. So to date, they have achieved some scale against two specific game subgenres, bingo and solitaire. However, the big question mark for growth will really be around whether they can scale to a much wider audience and against other game genres or subgenres. When we look at the Skillz prospectus, we note that for the year ended December 31st, 2020, Solitaire, Cube, and 21 Blitz, each developed by Tether. Tether is the name of one of the game studios that they work with, together with Blackout Bingo, developed by Big Run, which is the name of another game studio that they work with, accounted for 79% of our revenue. Games developed by Tether and Big Run accounted for 87% of our revenue for the year ended December 31st, 2020. So essentially, the risk here is that, again, they're highly concentrated in terms of these two subgenres of bingo and solitaire. Not only that, these three particular games account for 80% of their revenue. Now, both good and bad. Bad in the sense that they're not highly diversified, but good in the sense that one other hit game could potentially significantly drive growth for them. But I think that if we were to look at some of the data, and again, I'll provide a link in the show notes if to the newsletter if you want to see some of the graphs and charts. But when we look at for example, the download performance over the past year, we note that the current flagship titles that I just mentioned, those three titles, have been declining. The overall portfolio has been declining for Skillz, even with COVID and 2020, which was the best year in the history of free to play gaming. So I think that's a risk. Now, having said that, don't be surprised to see downloads or reported revenue spike. I think word on the street is that there is kind of this new game from Big Run, which may do pretty well. They also have this announced partnership with NFL. I think wagering and NFL kind of like peanut butter and chocolate. So it's certainly possible for some new game to pop up in terms of the NFL. But I would think like in terms of aside from these like one-off ad hoc opportunistic opportunities, if we think from more of a structural longer term perspective, are they going to be able to achieve scale against multiple subgenres in a much bigger way? I think that's the big question mark, right? And so their ability to prove out the model, and to date, I'd say they haven't proven that they've been able to scale a profitable model and have really, I mean, I don't think you can say that they've fully achieved product market fit despite being a public games company. And I think the more disturbing thing is to note that much of the current growth in revenue reported by Skillz largely could be due to accounting shenanigans. Now, as reported by Eagle Eye Research about Skillz, and let me read you a quote from Eagle Eye Research. They state, "We believe the company is round tripping their revenue and sales and marketing expenses. They issue bonus cash to incentivize user engagement, which they record as an expense. Users then wager this bonus cash, which generates revenue for Skillz. Effectively, the company is recognizing revenue from virtual money it gave its customers to spend, although no real cash is generated in the process. We believe management has the ability to manufacture whatever revenue figure they desire. They can simply decide to issue more bonus cash, which quickly converts into revenue as it is spent. We do not allege willful misconduct, but simply point out that the risk exists. Recent high-profile failures and frauds involving round tripping include Luck and Coffee and ComScore. Both companies were coincidentally audited by the same audit firm as Skillz. So, in summary, I've got huge concerns about the medium to long-term growth prospects for Skillz based upon not only their model, not only their ability to, to prove out product market fit against their model, but because of these type of issues as well. They not only that they face, existential threats based on app store policies from Apple and Google that could potentially shut down their business at any time. And when you layer that on top of all these other issues, like the accounting issues and the fact that they face declines in their core games during the best year in the history of free-to-play gaming, it just it really just represents extremely high fundamental risk. But I do admit high reward because they're not having to develop their own content. They can partner for content development and they add this wagering competitive betting layer that's much more scalable if they're able to prove out this model. And so I would say, in my opinion, super high risk, potentially high reward, but from my perspective, the risk far outweighs the potential reward. And the last growth strategy I want to mention, the last company to talk about is Jam City. And so the way to think about Jam City essentially is as a company that is still banking on growth through content, right? And so one of the things that I mentioned is if you think about the ecosystem of game studios, let's say you have small scale game studios, mid tier game studios, and large scale game studios, that what we saw was a hollowing out of the middle. The middle got kind of picked off. And so we should see movement. Not to say the middle is completely gone, but all the easy pickings are gone in the middle. And so what would we expect? We'd expect then that if you want to continue growth, at least from a content perspective, you're either going to have to move to larger acquisitions or earlier stage acquisitions, right? And so I think that that's what we can expect to see from Jam City, but in fact, a two-pronged model. So first, I think that they're going to go earlier stage companies. Why? Because they only have $115 million of cash post SPAC transaction. And so with that limited amount of capital, I think that you're going to have to go for cheaper, earlier stage acquisitions to beef up their content pipeline. But I also think that what you would probably expect from a deal structure perspective is something that we've seen similar to recent deals structures from Embracer that focus more on earnout to reduce the upfront purchase price and mitigate the risk of acquiring pre or early revenue based game studios, and also then provides an upside for management teams that also get acquired, gives them that incentives to stick around and make their games profitable. And I think that the second strategy is going to be around IP licensed games. Jam City had been increasingly moving towards launching licensed IP based games. That's been a shift that they've already been moving towards. We saw this with the launch of Harry Potter, Hogwarts Mystery. We saw their acquisition of Disney Emoji Blitz when Disney exited gaming. And we now see that even further with the acquisition of Ludia, who are IP specialists. And as noted last week, I think that this may be a good strategy in the sense that IP based games may benefit from IDFA deprecation. So if that winds up being true, again, it's still to be determined, but conceptually, potentially something that will happen, then actually not a bad move. And we also note when we look at some of the public disclosure from Jam City in terms of their future pipeline, some of the games that they mentioned are a Disney Pop Town game launch, some type of new DC-based game, an HDTV game, a Star Wars game, and an Avatar game. So clearly you can see this is where they're going. They're moving towards IP licensed titles. And to wrap this all up, so Jam City, in terms of outlook for me, and by the way, I am a fan of the company and a lot of the people working there. But just to keep it real, I do think that they are going to be challenged for growth. I think, any company can break out with a single hit game. So there's always the potential for a big hit and massive growth off of that single hit. However, historically, when we look at the data, what we see from Jam City and Ludia has not been a super high growth revenue or downloads trajectory, even in the face of COVID in 2020 as well. And I think that when we look at where Jam City expects to get a lot of its growth, when we look at some of the SPAC transaction investor materials, we see that they're essentially banking on almost all of the growth coming from new games. And so if that is the case, I just think that that's going to be fairly difficult. So anyway, in conclusion, you kind of see all of these companies, these four companies, Zynga, Applovin, Skillz, and Jam City, represent very differentiated approaches to this big question of 2021. How do we continue to get growth? Now, just to be clear, I am a little negative. Like, we've been on this huge bull market run in terms of games, huge growth that we've been through, but the tide is turning. The market is shifting a little bit. And so while I'm a huge fan of all game companies, I've fully realized how difficult it is to find success in our market. And so, despite the challenges, I definitely hope all four of these companies, I wish them all great success. I believe we live in an infinite world. So I definitely hope that they are successful. But I do think that overall, I feel like even with these four different models, I think all of them are relatively challenged. Having said that, just in conclusion here, I'm also happy to speak to any representatives from the companies mentioned and happy to have a panel discussion, one-on-one interview in response to any of the thoughts that I have stated. So if you are interested in talking to me about this stuff, just let me know and happy to publish that. Thanks, guys. That's it. Those are the fourth growth strategies from these four public or soon to be public companies, as Jam City is not fully spec'd yet, but on its way. And hopefully, I will catch you all later. Bye, everybody.